Hi guys, welcome back to another Frazier Virtual Museum video. We're bringing you new content every day on our website and also on our social media channels. So please stay tuned every day. We're highlighting stories from the galleries. I'm in the vintage bottle hall right now. And we're also highlighting our favorite stories to talk about with guests. So the story I'm highlighting today comes from Prohibition era Kentucky. Prohibition was a period of time 100 years ago when the US government said that nobody could buy, sell, distribute, or drink alcohol. Now the only exception to this would have been medicinal whiskey, because that's right, people drank whiskey as cough medicine occasionally. So what would you do if you were a distiller during this time period? You could A, apply for a medicinal license. A lot of distillers were trying to do this so that the government could approve them and they could stay in operation. But medicinal licenses were really hard to get approved, and unfortunately a lot of distilleries closed because they couldn't get the license. B, you could bootleg, which a lot of people were doing. People were avoiding law enforcement in hilariously creative ways. For example, if you tried to set up a sale over the telephone, law enforcement or even your neighbors could listen in to what you were saying. So a lot of people developed code words for their whiskey supply, for example. One seller in New York talked about his soap warehouse. Instead of talking about the bottles of whiskey he was selling, he substituted that by saying he was selling bars of soap. So law enforcement was none the wiser. A lot of people were traveling along the criminal corridor, which involved a lot of cities in the Midwest, particularly here in Louisville, because we had easy access between Nashville and Chicago to sell illegal goods. Or C, you could pick up your entire operation and move it to a different country that didn't have the Prohibition law. So comment below and let me know what you would do if you were a distiller. The story that I wanted to highlight today is all about a woman named Mary Dowling. Mary Dowling had inherited a distillery in Anderson County, Kentucky from her husband after he died. Now, this happened about a decade before Prohibition happened, but she had a lot of business acumen and she was a really talented distiller in her own right. And so she grew her husband's company, Waterfill Frazier, to a huge number of warehouses, and by the time Prohibition hit, they had about 40,000 barrels of bourbon, and they didn't know what to do with it. So she, in fact, chose all three options. First, she applied for a whiskey, a medicinal license, and she was denied, at least at first. And so instead, she went to her friend, Pappy Van Winkle, who was another distiller, and offered their family a bunch of barrels that she was trying to sell or get rid of before the law officially was enforced. So the next thing she did with some of the barrels was to bootleg them. She had a small operation where she would sell to a few of her friends, and it was up to them where they would distribute later. Unfortunately, in 1924, federal agents were onto her scheme, and so they set up a sting operation. They had two men who she formerly did business with become turncoat bootleggers, and they were actually working for the federal government. They catch her in a sale when they start loading barrels up into their truck, and she and her family are taken to court. Mary pointed out that there was a stipulation in the law that said you could, if you had barrels that were in your basement from pre-Prohibition, you could still use those for medicinal use, or you could host very small private parties. However, the government wasn't buying it and they were ready to prosecute. Before anything happened though, in 1926, as fate would have it, the stenographer who was taking shorthand notes of the trial passed away, and nobody could read their shorthand, so they threw the case out. So Mary Dowling went home and decided, you know, in order to continue business appropriately and to make any kind of money, since this was her craft and what she knew how to do, she approached the Beam family, as in Jim Beam, and asked them to help her move her entire distillery to Juarez, Mexico, which is close to the US border. So she spent the rest of her career after 1926 in Juarez, selling to not only Mexico and Central America, but also hosting a lot of thirsty tourists who came across the US border, and they could get themselves a couple bottles of Waterfill and Frazier and even sneak a couple home to their friends. So I hope you enjoyed this story and keep watching for an activity or game that you can play at home. As I mentioned, we're in the vintage bottle hall here at the Frazier, and this is actually a Waterfill and Frazier bottle from 1928. On the box in the back, you can see Mary Dowling's name. Many distillers would stamp their name on their product. And as I mentioned, since this is from 1928 and it does say for medicinal use only, I wonder if later on she was able to secure her medicinal license, or since her operation had changed to Mexico, the US government was more willing to work with her in terms of licensing so that they weren't having a lot of illegal product flow back and forth between the border. Okay, so here's your activity for today. If you don't know any card games, go online and see if you can find one that you think is really interesting or that you think would be fun to play. Learn the rules and teach it to your family. Some of these games you can play with just 2 people. There should be a game for everybody. Often card games were played in saloons and speakeasies, and so it kind of speaks to the era. Let us know what game you like to play. Let's say, for example, you come across Gin Rummy. If you chose that game to learn, go ahead and put it down in the comments below and have fun.